presenting on the role of alternatives in singular causation.
Thank you. This is high enough, I hope. So, like Chris, I'm very rarely accused of being too quiet. So thanks. This is a little bit going to be interesting because there's a lot of overlaps with some of the things that both Chris and Toby were talking about, but approaching things from a somewhat different direction. Just a kind of refresher that probably is unnecessary after the last two talks. This is what happens when we don't actually coordinate ahead of time about exactly what we're each going to be doing. So I'm going to be focused here about singular causation, things like the K key caused the particular configuration of pixels on the computer screen, or this coffee I had this morning is making my hands shake, not the medication I was taking, which, there are these different words that get thrown around: actual causation, token causation, singular causation. There are, some people think there's differences. None of that's actually going to matter. The important thing is to contrast it with the kind of general or type causal relations, things like in general, pressing K keys causes certain configurations. In general, coffee drinks causes muscle tremors, right? So what I'm interested in is thinking about this relation of singular causation. And in particular, I'm going to be focused on judgments of singular causation. So it's not about what is it out in the world, but what is it in our heads. There's probably some relation between those two things. It doesn't have to be identical. But this being the psychology as one of the P's in SVP means I figure I should focus on the judgment part. And Lori, I think, left, so that's good. I don't have to worry about that. About her getting upset with me. So there's, Chris gave us one kind of standard familiar story about singular causation. There's another one, though, that I think is much more common in the philosophical literature, not necessarily as familiar to people here at SVP. And that is the idea of singular causation as this sort of localist thing. Uh-oh, Lori's back. As this localist thing that what it means, the notion of singular causation really is just about what happened. Here's the kind of familiar story in a certain areas of philosophy. Is just about sort of what happened in the sort of space-time region connecting C and E. Maybe we also have to add in laws of nature or something like that. So this is Phil Dow. Now this is talking about what singular causation is in the world, not what it is in our judgments of it. But this idea of singular causation obtains in virtue only of local factors, right? Factors that obtain in the space-temporal region containing the stretching between the cause and the effect, right? Peter Menzies, back in his 1996 paper, with Jim Bogan, where he's talking fractions, they're starting to blur the line to get into judgments, right? And both of them, in their own ways, argue that when you're talking about singular causation, what matters is this sort of very local thing, right? It's just about what takes place in this particular sort of spatio-temporal worm connecting C and E in some sense. And at a first pass, you might say, okay, so what that means is that alternatives just don't matter. What matters is what really happened. We just don't worry about alternatives. Here's the part where, not coordinating with the previous speakers, you've already seen alternatives are going to matter, right? But I'm going to suggest they matter in a different way than Toby and Chris did. So hopefully there'll be something new here. But the general sort of intuition of this kind of localism is that it just doesn't matter what the alternatives are. What matters is supposed to be what happened, hence the actual part of the actual causation that is sometimes described as. Now, here's a different way in which alternatives matter that isn't about counterfactuals directly, but is actually much simpler. It's just about, and these are ideas, I think I first was introduced to them by reading a paper of Jonathan Schaefer's, but other people have pointed it out, including Chris, about contrastive effects. So consider a simple claim. Yesterday, I had to get up early, so I drank 5 cups of coffee and I had shaky hands, right? So is it the case that drinking the 5 cups of coffee yesterday caused my hands to be shaky? Well, at least our judgments about that are going to depend in part on what we take to be the alternatives, right? Hence the contrastive part. So it's not about counterfactuals, it's what, in some sense, about counterfactuals, but it's sort of about potential hypothetical counterfactuals. That is, so if the contrast case is no coffee, right, then it seems plausible to say, yes, drinking 5 cups of coffee caused me to have shaky hands, right? And of course, part of that is because the contrast now is picking out a particular counterfactual salient. If I had had no coffee instead, then my hands would not have been shaking. But now consider that the contrast is, well, for whatever reason, I would have been forced, if I didn't have 5 cups of coffee, I would have had to have 10 cups of coffee. Did those 5 cups of coffee make my hands shaky? Here, I think, at the very least, my intuitions, and when I pose this to other people, and the low chuckles I heard suggest me that other people, I'm not quite sure what to say in this case. Because it certainly seems as though what matters is I had a lot of coffee, right? And so this idea, if I had had 10 cups of coffee, yes, my hands still would have been shaky, but that doesn't make the 5 cups any less of a cause. So I think it's very difficult in some ways to think about this. So what we might do, and what a lot of people suggest is, all right, at the very least, we have to amend our localism, in a certain sense, to allow for alternatives. So we have to specify what the alternatives are at C. And as Chris and Toby showed so nicely, we also have to allow for certain kinds of counterfactuals. Right? So we have to amend the localism to say, well, if C had been different, or if E had been different, or if C had been, if I hadn't worn a helmet, but I had changed my visibility, would I still, right? But this is all still involving this kind of now we've got multiple space-time worms connecting C and E in Chris's case, right? But it still is about this, it's still, I think, in a fundamental way, plausibly local, right? Now maybe the word actual, we should not use that anymore, but it still is a very localist kind of picture. It's about what's going on in C and E. Now, what I would suggest is that's actually wrong. Singular causal judgments are not local, and in fact we shouldn't have expected them to be local. You've already seen a taste of this. Think about Toby's case with the brick, right? That's a non-local change. It doesn't involve anything about the space-time worm involving the things. But the presence or absence of the brick, or rather the location of the brick, makes a big difference in our judgments of singular causation, right? At least in his experiment. So that's already pointing towards other kinds of things in the world can matter outside of what's between the space-time world. But let me give a different sort of way of getting to a very high level, simpler sort of conclusion, right? So here's the idea. First, an epistemic claim. You might immediately object to this epistemic claim. I'm going to guess if you do, I know why. I'm going to get to it in a slide or two. But here's an epistemic claim. Singular causation can't actually be directly observed. This is, you can find this as far back as Hume. You can arguably find it back in Aristotle. But that you can't directly observe singular causation. We think we can. We might sometimes have this experience that we are directly observing singular causal relations, but we don't. And if we don't, then that means that judgments of singular causation have to themselves be inferences. Well, inferences are going to depend in part on alternative explanations for what actually happened. Because there's a different kind of alternative than thinking counterfactuals. It's thinking about what else happened in the world that could have produced the thing I saw, the thing I observed. Right? Because to the extent that these, let's see if I can figure out this thing. To the extent that these singular causation judgments are themselves inferences, alternative explanations will be defeaters. They will block the inference. Right? So as a simple example, if I flip a switch and the lights in the room turn off, right? Well, an alternative explanation might well be, did somebody else in the room flip a switch at the exact same time? If they did, then we have an alternative explanation. And even with the temporal synchrony there, of I flip the switch and the lights turn off, your judgments, at least intuitively, are going to be reduced about whether I am a singular cause of the lights going on. And it is reduced for this epistemic reason. You don't know. You have to make an inference to whether or not I was the singular cause of the lights turning off, or that other person flipping a switch at the same time. Okay? So, I think a key here is we're not talking about what you might think of as counterfactual alternative explanations. It's not tied to human limits, it's tied to simply a sort of very generalized epistemic challenge, which is we, again, I'm contending, and I'll come back to the obvious objection, we don't get direct access to singular causation in the world. We've known all along we don't get direct access to type-level causation about aspirin relieving headaches or this sort of thing. But I think it's a little bit, I think it's not been thought about as much about the epistemic problem of getting access to singular causation. Interestingly, that's one of the big things Hume's known for in philosophy, and yet those of us who do causal judgment and causal reasoning sometimes don't think as much about that part of the Humean story, or the Humean skeptics. quasi-skepticism, right? So what this means, of course, is non-local factors can matter. So singular causation is really not localist in any way, right? It wasn't actualist because of all the worries about alternatives and counterfactuals. Now we got to get rid of localism. So it's not. It's really trying to say singular causation is a lot richer than we might have thought it was. Okay, so what's the obvious reply? No, your epistemic claim is just false. We do observe singular causal relations. How do we do it? We do it with exactly all those wonderful videos that Toby just showed us. Causal perception, right? It's usually the heading that gets put under. So there's no epistemic problem. There's no need for inference. We don't have to consider alternative explanations. There's this rich literature, and I'll show you a few movies, not as nice and pretty as Toby's, but that's because I don't do the research, so I had to get them from other people, about causal perception. We just directly perceive the causal relations in the world. It's a very standard way of talking about these kinds of Michaud style studies. So what do I mean by causal perception? Well, here's some of the nice sort of canonical properties that people have attributed to it. It is automatic. You don't get top-down control, or at least it's very difficult. Attentional shifts in attention can change causal perception, so to the extent you think that those are top-down control, but they do it in a very coarse way. Happens very early in development. It is, in fact, to the extent that we've been able to get access to these things, neurally distinct from other kinds of causal reasoning and causal learning in the world. Right? So it seems like exactly the sort of thing where we might be directly observing causation in the world. So here is, let's see if I can figure out a way. All right, good. So here's a kind of just classic Michaud. These are called launching effect studies. Now I've lost my mouse. So if you haven't seen these before, right, not quite as pretty as Toby's, but the red ball causes the green ball to move. Right? We just see it. You can't help but see it. These are somewhat fragile in the sense that if you introduce spatial or temporal gaps in the sequence, you can eliminate it. So, oops. There we go. So consider this sequence. Most people see this as at least attenuated causation, right? It's not as causal. It's not just balls bouncing into each other. You can get shattering effects. I mean, this one especially, personally, I find this incredibly vivid. You can't help but see this as the brown ball causing the green ball to shatter. These all involve spatiotemporal contact. You don't need that. So here, the center ball is just immediately and almost without ability to stop yourself, you perceive the middle one as pulling the others along. Okay? All right, so those are standard causal perception effects. And it sure seems like these are cases where we might well want to say, look, what we're really getting is we're getting direct access to what's going on in the world. We are directly observing singular causation. All right? Okay, so for those of you who know Brian Scholl's work, what I'm about to show you is going to be, you may well have seen it before, but watch the following thing. I'm going to do this without sort of priming you, but watch this sequence here and see what you think. Show that again. Now, many people, myself included, see that sequence as a single ball moving continuously across the screen with a color change in the middle. Okay? If you saw it as sort of one ball hitting another ball, I'm going to play it again. For many people, and it's not everybody, but there is a non-trivial fraction of people, myself included, that experience this as just a single thing moving continuously with a color change in the middle. So for those of you who didn't get that experience, let me show you and see if sort of, now that you've been primed to think of it that way. Okay. All right. Now I'm going to show you a different movie. Okay. At the very least, we can agree that that first one, it's ambiguous. There are some people who have this just behavior, right? Now for this one, the top is exactly the same, okay, in terms of the pixels on the screen. Show it again. Okay, the empirical data are clear. Everyone perceives the top now as a launching effect. Nobody continues, in those cases, to see it as a single ball moving across with a color change. So just to remind you, here's the ambiguous one, right? Here is the completely non-ambiguous one. Okay? And there are other studies that Brian's done that look at all kinds of context effects. So doing all kinds of different things elsewhere on the screen can take an ambiguous stimulus and lead you to perceive it as causal, or lead you to perceive it as decidedly non-causal. There's also ones that you kind of like, yeah, I think that's probably causal, but then what happens is other stuff on the screen and you go, oh no, it's definitely not causal. Okay? So how do we explain this if what we're really doing is getting direct access to the causal structure of the world? Well, I think a very natural explanation is certainly the one that we find this in the paper on this phenomenon of this particular one called causal capture, is that a very natural way to think about it is that what's going on is you have to do, your visual system is doing implicit inference. Right? There really are two explanations available to you. And this is all subversive, this is not conscious, but that there's essentially two explanations available to you. One, for the bottom cases, right? The ones that are completely unambiguous. Right? One possibility is that you actually have two different sort of underlying causal systems. Right? One, in which case the top can be perceived as continuous motion with a color change. But now you've got this really unexplained synchrony. Right? You've got this unexplained synchrony, which is, but the red ball started moving at the same time. So that seems weird. It's possible coincidences happen, but it's weird. Right? In the second explanation is, no, there's actually just kind of one underlying causal structure. We just didn't know that there was because we didn't see a connection between them, or I didn't tell you these are part of the same machinery, as it were. Right? And so it's a little bit weird. Now the top one's a little bit strange because you had this complete occlusion. Right? Normally when things bump into each other, it's never the case that when they bump into each other, one's completely obscuring the other. That's weird. But that's not too weird, you might think, especially given some noise in the visual system, right? So the argument then becomes, look, the visual system prefers the second explanation in some, again, implicit sense, right? Which is to say, if there's an alternative explanation present, the causal perception shifts. Put differently, your singular causal judgments depend on whether there's an alternative explanation for the phenomena you're seeing. And that's in causal perception, right? Now, you might say, does this extend to more cognitive stuff? I think actually the role of alternative explanations is an alternative, not necessarily mutually exclusive, to some of the things that Chris is pointing out with regards to norms. So think about the pen case. If you violate a social norm, then you're judged as more of a cause. So two individuals jointly produce an effect. The social norm violator is judged as more of a cause than the non-norm violator. But notice that social and institutional norms carry with them additional information about, for example, explanations of why some outcome came about. We ban just those activities that are likely, in an explanatory way, to produce the bad outcomes, right? So that means that we've actually, the violator is actually kind of a better explanation, without getting too deep into what we mean exactly by explanation. Or the fact that if I intend an outcome to occur, then I'm more of a cause than if it accidentally occurs, even if my actions and the outcome are exactly the same. So you match those in the vignette. The difference is just whether my action intended the outcome or intended something else. You find quite regularly that the agent is judged as more of a cause in the intentional case. But again, goals or intention are themselves pointing to somebody being a better explanation. I'm a better explanation of why something occurred if I wanted it to occur, if I intended it to occur, if I had that goal. Right? So it might be about norm, might not be directly about norms. It might not be about norms and availability. Maybe it is that as well. But I want to suggest it might also be that norms carry with them a lot of other kinds of information about patterns and explanations in the world outside of this particular case. That this is sort of like some of the explanations of framing effects in terms of the additional information carried by language choice. Right? That the existence of the norm isn't just that there's a norm. There's a whole lot of other information that's carried or is inferred by people when they hear that there is a norm for or against something, or an intention. So just because I felt I'd better give some data of my own, so here's another way in which alternative explanations can matter, which is that the reliability of the cause should matter. Because more reliable causes are better explanations of why something occurred than less reliable. Now, reliability, if you might what we wanted to do, and the we here is David Rose and Edouard Machery. Edouard, very grouchy in the picture, but I don't have a newer one of him, so those of you who know him, he's a much happier fellow. So what we were interested in is we wanted to get it to just like the most bare bones kind of reliability we could, right? So we didn't want there to be a mechanism, we didn't want to have design or any of these sorts of things. So what we did is we had a reliability condition. So the idea is there's a rock, it's a little bit up the hill, sitting there, there's an earthquake, rock rolls down the hill, takes out a tree. Okay? In the reliable condition, there are things on either side of the rock such that, given that it starts rolling, it's going to smash the tree. In the unreliable condition, it's up at the top of the hill in a big field. Participants, importantly, are not shown this trajectory, like we describe it this way. They don't see it moving, so there's no perceptual effects here, or at least no direct perceptual effects. But the idea is, what we wanted to look at in this, and this wasn't exactly what we were thinking, but how I'm starting to think about it now is that the difference between these is that there's a very, basically the rock starting to roll is a really good explanation over here of why the tree gets destroyed. It's not a very good explanation over here about why the tree got destroyed, because there's so many other things that you have to add to really explain what's going on, right? I'm deliberately not trying to tease apart reliability or explanation or even counterfactuals here, right? You might think the counterfactuals here are much weaker, much more sensitive to particular conditions. I think these things, as a community, we're still struggling about how to disentangle some of these. But I just want to add this notion of the existence of alternative explanations is important because what we find, you'll be unsurprised to learn, is that the rock starting to roll is significantly more of a cause in the reliable condition than in the unreliable condition. Right? So the idea, what I've just been trying to suggest here is that this thing of singular causation, not only do we have to pay attention to counterfactuals and alternatives and contrast in C and E and the pathways and the sort of space-time worms connecting them, but we actually have to look much broader because there's this epistemic gap. We don't have direct access to singular causation in the world, so we have to look at contextual effects that can give us alternative explanations. And so we don't have localism, we don't have actualism, we've got singular causation, which is why I use that in my title and not actual causation, because one slogan would be singular causation is not local, it's not actual. Well then what is it? Let me just conjecture that if explanation really is playing this key role, then you might think that it's something like the ability to take what you find, this relation, and port it. If you know Tanya Lombroso's work, the idea of explanation for export or exportable dependencies, that suggests that actually singular causation might be reliable. That it might be that what we're doing single causal judgments, is we're trying to pick out the reliable relations in the world, in part because we're going to want to use them further in the future, but that's very much conjecture. So, thanks.